Since it was set up in 1994, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, arguably the most powerful grant maker in the world, has given out about $23 billion to charitable causes. Its best known work is its search for a cure for malaria, but it also funds much more widely in global health, the US education system and beyond. And the foundation is, for the most part, very widely respected and applauded. But what if the Gateses had chosen instead to use all of their money and taken all of it and given it to, say, Harvard University, just one lump sum entirely to Harvard University? Would the many champions of the generosity of the Gateses be quite so impressed and quite so bullish in that case? And what if they'd gone a step further and made it a requirement of the grant that Harvard changed its name to Gates University? Would we find such self-aggrandizing philanthropy even less appealing? This evening, I want to ask whether we can and whether we should judge charitable actions. Should all giving be applauded, or should we in some cases be looking to encourage better and more thoughtful giving by donors instead? One often hears exhortations to people to give more, but rarely does one hear pleas for donors to give better or more smartly. And in this lecture I want to explore whether and how one can frame an argument for donors to give well. First, though, I want to acknowledge two major things that I think are wrong with UK giving, and which don't get enough discussion, I feel. They are the low levels of giving and the decline in the number of people giving. The most recent figures for the level of giving are now a little dated, they're from 2008-9, but they show aggregate giving by individuals of just under £10 billion, which is less than 1% of national income. And that percentage is basically flatlined, it's basically not changed for about the last 20 years. So as we have got richer, we have not become more generous as a nation. And that giving is coming from fewer of us. There's been a decline, quite a serious decline, in the number of people giving at all. That same set of data showed that in a typical month, only 54% of people give to a charity. So just over half the population. A decade ago, that number was about 68%. That decline is an equivalent to about 1 in 8 of the population stopping giving to charity at all. And I think that's disturbing and rather worrying and needs more attention, as does the low level of giving in the first place. And I think those two important data points provide a kind of crucial context for what I'm going to say about how well donors give and whether we might encourage them to give better. So the two key questions I want to address are, first, can you assess and judge different charitable acts in terms of their morality? Is some giving simply better than others? And second, if you can address and perhaps rank destinations for giving, should you? I think there are two central aspects to giving well. They are choosing the most important causes, and then choosing the best organisations. For practical reasons, I'm going to concentrate on the first of those, choosing the best causes. Now, a couple of years ago, the philosopher Peter Singer wrote a provocative and quite compelling book called The Life You Can Save. This was a clear and unequivocal call for people to give more to charities. In particular, he wanted people to give more to charities working to combat extreme poverty and promote international development. Singer's call was based very explicitly on moral reasoning. He argued that there was a moral imperative for us to give more. And that moral dimension was echoed in the announcement in the summer that 38 American billionaires were going to pledge more than half of their wealth to give to charity, following the lead set by Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. And that giving pledge that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have started and they're rolling out around the world, it describes itself very explicitly as a moral commitment. Now, if one can construct a moral argument that people should give and give more, is it not also morally right to give well? There is no difference between the two in principle, I think, only in practice. If I have a duty to give more to alleviate suffering, then surely I have a duty to ensure that I alleviate as much suffering as possible. I cannot see how the two can be distinguished, really. If you believe in one, you surely believe in the other. Another way of putting this might be to say that donors should seek to apply their funding more effectively. Instead of just saying to donors that they should give, say, 20% more, maybe we should ask donors to be 20% better, to pick more clearly the right causes and work hard to find the best organisations that are going to have a greater impact and help more people's lives. Now, most people, I think, already casually make judgments about what type of giving is right, and I think one's instinctive response to the questions about the Gates Foundation reflects that. Another illustration can be made quite simply. Imagine that Peter Singer's book was not called The Life You Can Save, but instead was called The Stradivarius You Can Save. It might be just as heartfelt, but a call to save a musical instrument would lack, I feel, the same moral force. Where we give matters morally, I think. Some charitable causes are just better and more deserving than others. But charity law and how we classify charities does not reflect this. All charities are equally worthy before the law, and before the taxman, for that. Of course, our understanding of what is legitimately charitable does change over time. One of the earliest examples of a charity in England raised funds to purchase wood to burn witches. And more recently, in the 20th century, charities distributed cigarettes in hospitals to wounded soldiers. And that was eventually disqualified as a charitable purpose. But such changes happened very slowly. The Charity Commission's guidance on public benefit states, and I quote, "The courts have taken the view that only a radical change of social and economic circumstances, supported by sufficient evidence, would justify deciding that something previously accepted as charitable is no longer charitable." The reality is that giving to registered charities provides some protection that money is being used to good effect, but only little protection. A few charities inadvertently even do harm. Yet neither the courts nor the Commission are much used in assessing whether seemingly sensible charity activities do damage. Poorly managed mentoring, for example, can leave children worse off than if they had no mentoring. Attempts to scare straight children, an intuitively smart way to deal with kind of bad behaviour bordering on criminality and violence, actually makes things worse. But you won't find any guidance from the Charitable Commission that says avoid charities that do these things or do them badly. In other words, don't rely too much on regulation to tell you what to avoid. Now, that's not a criticism of the Charity Commission. It's simply how it is designed. It is not constituted to tell you what works. It merely interprets and polices the intention to provide public benefit. So even if a donor takes a very straightforward maxim of like, do no harm, there are risks and dangers, and there are no simple rules. And that obviously begs the question of whether the donor should be held responsible for their decisions and what they do with their money. Or more positively, is there a way we can make donors feel more obliged to choose well where they give? We need to be more ambitious, I believe, and think beyond the current public benefit rules. We need to ask whether it is possible to design frameworks that catalogue causes and ultimately charities according to their field of work. One could then say that certain causes and organisations are inherently more worthwhile than others. There have been attempts before to prioritise causes. One example is the Copenhagen Consensus, which gathers together eminent economists, many of them Nobel Prize winners, and asks them to deliberate and discuss and choose and prioritise how they would spend a notional $50 billion. Now, some people have objected to the Copenhagen Consensus for all sorts of reasons, I'll spare you. But the process of teasing out what is important has value and merit, I think. Peter Singer's book, The Life You Can Save, contains an implicit belief that some charitable giving in causes is better than others. He declares child mortality as the most pressing reason for people to give more. And I think it would be quite hard to construct an argument against that. Others take a different approach. For example, the academic and Clinton-era politician Robert Reich believes charitable giving to curb inequality is better than giving that doesn't do anything about inequality and maybe even worsens it. Reich has proposed that there should be tax breaks for charities that direct support to the poor and reduce inequality, and not for charities that don't do that. This obviously assumes that reducing inequality is desirable, and I'm not going to get into that debate here. The important point is that Reich puts forward an argument that says that we can rank charitable causes. Within individual fields, too, one can see attempts to decide what is most important. In fact, at MPC, we do this for some clients. We help them think through the process and go through the process of deciding where their money would be best applied in terms of causes and then in terms of organisations. Now, you could argue that all such attempts are based on some notion of what is important, and they're not independent of values. And there's no universal moral standard that we can apply to it, and therefore it's not possible to define the most deserving charitable causes. And I can accept that to some extent, but not completely. I think attempts to prioritize charitable causes are valuable, and they force us, at a minimum, to question the choices we make when we give away money. Making our implicit choices explicit is worthwhile. Perhaps a sensible place to start would be some sort of minimal system of prioritizing needs. Something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs could be useful, beginning with physiological needs like food and water, working through safety, through to self-esteem, and then to self-actualization. Now, there are problems with Maslow's hierarchy, but it wouldn't provide a bad starting point to think about what's important, what is most important in terms of charitable needs. And also, such a hierarchy could even accommodate contradicting charitable goals. Let's consider one pair of charities whose goals are in direct opposition: the British Humanist Association and the Catholic Trust. The British Humanist Association aims to promote humanism, you won't be surprised to hear. It wants to stop worship in schools. And it was a supporter of the Protest the Pope campaign, which tried to stop the Pope's visit from being a state occasion. In contrast, the Catholic Trust for England and Wales works to promote the Catholic Church and supported the Pope's visit. You can imagine those two organisations each trying to outdo the other, vying to deliver more of what they think of as public benefit, and one in effect cancelling out the other. As one delivers more public benefit, the other one delivers less. But despite those obvious conflicts, each organisation could sit comfortably within Maslow's hierarchy, and then donors would be free to choose according to their beliefs and their wishes. So I think it is possible to create frameworks in which one can understand more about the importance of certain charitable causes. At a minimum, such a hierarchy would add to the information that donors have at their disposal and provide a richer understanding of the work of charities. Any such scheme would obviously be imperfect, but the present system and law are also imperfect. More so, I believe. And a first attempt to do this would lead to further, better attempts, improving on the first one. Eventually, one might be able to go further and catalogue individual charities. You could get classification of purpose, work, and goal. Maybe also we can get to classifying successes and failures. In a previous RSA lecture, I lamented the way we as a society talk about charitable giving, arguing that the language we use around charitable giving seems to imply that all charities are equally deserving and effective. On that occasion, I said some charities must be better than others, delivering better performance and more clearly changing people's lives. Understanding this and placing charities within any hierarchy, within any framework, requires information, thought, and analysis. And that is another aspect of giving well. Having chosen the right causes, how do you choose the right organisations? That is, frankly, a simple question with a very complicated answer that I'm not going to provide tonight, and I think is only even partly worked out by anyone just yet. But I want to keep it just as an abstract question here now. I don't want to get into how one chooses good or the best charities. Suffice to say that I think it is possible to make progress on this with enough effort and time, to pick well, not necessarily best, but to pick well. But I'll return to that thought in a moment. Let me summarise where I've got to so far. I think some charitable causes are more worthwhile than others, morally so. They should get greater attention, greater focus, and more funding. That much is, I think, frankly, uncontroversial. Further, I think one can make progress towards a taxonomy and ranking of causes, prioritising those which are most important. It's difficult, perhaps impossible, to do that precisely, but I think it is possible to do it better than the current system. Giving donors more information and encouraging them to pick the good charities within their areas of interest should then be easier. Now that then begs the second question of, if you can create such a scheme, should you do so? Now, given that it's MPC's raison d'etre, it might seem absurd for someone from MPC to question whether you can develop a framework to judge charitable causes. We analyse charities, we have a framework to do this, we look at lots of charities, we think about this quite a lot, and we're trying to promote a better market in which money goes to the right places. It's the very DNA of our organisation to analyse charities and think about effectiveness. But here I'm interested in how valuable a framework would be to influence donor behaviour. Developing a framework to assess and rank causes and ultimately charities is only going to be useful if it gets used. Otherwise, it's going to be a waste of time. Now, recent research from Beth Breeze at the University of Kent indicates that British donors do not select causes based on levels of greatest need. To quote her research, people do not give to the most urgent needs, but rather they support causes that mean something to them, based on looking at a sample of kind of very committed and engaged donors. They're also not interested in the messy and imperfect data that is available to them about charities. Now, the consequence of all this, though, is, as Beth says, there remains an important and as yet largely unaddressed question about how to reconcile the freedom and autonomy of the donor with the pursuit of solidarity, social coherence, and a moral belief in meeting the basic needs of all. A more blunt conclusion might be that donors are often not very good, very thoughtful, or very moral. Moral in the act of giving, perhaps, but not moral in where they give. Another study, this time in the US, was carried out by Hope Consulting. It's a very interesting study that is worth looking at. It looks at 30% of the top income households in the US, and it catalogues them into 6 different types according to how they give money. They range from repayer, someone who supports charities that have personally influenced them, through casual givers and personal ties, people who just respond to questions or where there's a direct self-interest they get that is satisfied in return for their giving, through to high impact, where donors support the causes they think generate most good. When they catalogue donors in that way, what they find is that only 14% of donors fit into the category of high impact. And that turns into just $1 in $8 of charitable giving being targeted to the most important, most effective organisations, or even trying to do that. Now, that research, to me, is quite fascinating, and it raises the obvious question of whether one type of donor is better than another. And it won't surprise you, I guess, to hear that I think that the best type of donor out of those categories is the high-impact donor. I certainly think the high-impact donor is better than the casual giver. And I also think that the high-impact donor is better than the repayer, where, to my mind, there's just too much self-interest involved. I am making moral judgments here quite clearly, and you could argue that donors are free to act as they wish, and I accept that. But that doesn't make my moral judgments redundant or wrong. Moral standards might conflict here. Some would prioritise individual donors' rights, their freedom to choose above all else. But my concern is that this freedom leads to a poor distribution of charitable giving. Another interesting aspect of Hope Consulting's work concerns the way donors use information. Only 35% of donors use any research at all on charities. They typically spend, if they do any research, less than 2 hours on it. Only 1 in 8 of those donors who are using research in the first place are trying to find good organisations. The majority of donors are doing research to validate their choices. So it seems to me donors are not really in the market for advice, generally speaking, on where and how to give well. Now, Hope Consulting's work covers US donors only, but I think it chimes with what Beth Breeze found for the UK. And it also chimes with some messages from a survey conducted by YouGov earlier this year. In this YouGov survey, 68% of people said they would transfer their support if they discovered a charity was performing badly. That's all well and good so far. But less than half of donors were interested in a charity rating system. And more than 2/3 of donors said they wouldn't respond to a charity rating system at all. They're quite confident in how and where they're giving. And only 18%, less than 1 in 5, said they would feel more obliged to give if they knew which charities were the best performing. So I think this is not donor activism in practice. I think this is donor satisfaction shading into donor indifference. Again, one can accept donors' rights to behave in this way, but you can still frown on their behaviour. Perhaps, though, we should forgive donors. Their limitations might not be conscious. They might follow from the way their brains are wired. There's a growing body of research looking at how our brains respond to certain stimuli. Now, so one part of that research shows that charitable giving gives people a warm glow. And you can detect that in activities in the brain, quite explicitly. And that, frankly, kind of rather unremarkable sense, charitable giving is rational. I give because I feel good when I give. Most donors could tell you that, but research has established it quite clearly. So human beings are ultimately self-serving even in the act of giving. But more of this research gets closer to understanding the real problem in the way that we behave as human beings. Because it shows the way we process information means that our emotional response is more powerful than our analytical response. If you present people with an image and a story, they are more generous in their charitable giving than if you give them some data which requires them to process that data and analyze it. Now, this seems to be due to the structure of our brain quite explicitly, and the field of social cognitive neuroscience is making strides in helping us understand this. Now, I'm going to caricature this enormously now, so if there are any neuroscientists in the room, you should probably look away now for a moment as I ruin your subject. You can think of the brain as having two parts. There's an X system and a C system. The X system is about our instinctive reactions and our thoughts. And the C system is where we do analytical thinking and where we process data. The X system includes much of our sort of empathetic responses to other people. That goes hand in hand with charitable giving. And it's the X system that gets turned on when we give money to charity. When we start thinking and analysing, the C system kicks in to help us process kind of data, things that we don't have an instinctive, easy response to. But research shows, very strikingly, that the C system can disrupt the X system. In other words, if we think too much, we can reduce our ability to respond instinctively, including our ability to empathise, which in turn might explain how data and information about charitable giving actually blunts our charitable actions. It reduces our empathy and our natural response. Now, if I think about this too much, my brain starts to hurt, but I think it is an important field of research, and I think what it suggests is that maybe it's not our fault that we're fickle, casual, and lazy as donors. It's just the way we're wired. In other words, don't blame the donor, blame human nature and blame evolution. It's just the way we're made. We're not made to be sensible or rational. And it means that we should not expect donors to be rational or thoughtful. In fact, we should try to stop them from thinking too much, because if they think too much, that will dull their charitable impulses. And I recently visited Jerusalem and went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum there, which has been redesigned to include many more direct testimonies and experiences of the Holocaust. And I was told as I went around the museum that one of the reasons for this was that they felt people found it difficult to respond to facts and figures about the Holocaust and found it far easier to respond to the direct testimonies. And there's a much better way for engaging people. And that may be just a function of the way our brains are wired. Now, fundraisers might nod their heads and sort of say rather wearily, that's why we do what we do in the way that we do it. So you've finally worked out how our industry works. But my concern is that that does not produce good behaviour by donors. We need to work out, I think, how to change donors' behaviour, how to get them to be more thoughtful or more smart, and maybe to embed information more effectively and more emotively so that donors make better choices. So what is to be done? I think we have a problem. I think there are good moral reasons to rank charitable causes some above others. And I think that's why it might be worth hard work to do that. But donors in the main might not use such a system. Donors don't really want to give for impact. They don't really want to engage their brains when they do give. In fact, as I said, doing so might be damaging to how much they give. So investing in a framework to catalogue, assess, and rank charitable causes might be creating a white elephant. It may be beautifully crafted and thoughtfully designed, perhaps, but unwanted, unused, and unloved. And I think that dilemma is sufficiently important that we should do something about it somehow. Now, it might be tempting to start criticising donors for not being good or moral enough, but I think that would be wrong. I think in the UK we have a tendency to criticise people who give, particularly rich people who give, such that it might put them off. And I think in a very tiny way that was illustrated this summer by the response to the giving pledge I mentioned earlier, in a statement from Baroness Mary Warnock, when she said in The Observer, "I can't but applaud this initiative. I can't but applaud this initiative of 38 billionaires pledging to give away at least half of their wealth." It's, I think, a fairly typically curmudgeonly response to charitable giving. Now, she may have been in that article reflecting the fact that some other people might have done that, but in so doing, she was, I think, reflecting a typically British attitude towards giving. So I think in the UK you can get condemned for being rich and condemned for being rich and giving it away. I think criticising giving seems unlikely to promote it. And I think criticising the behaviour of donors won't promote giving either. Donors might decide they're not going to give at all if they're going to get flack for the way they do it. And the many non-givers might decide not to start giving at all. So I think the way to respond is not to start criticising donors' behaviour. I think we need to find ways in which we can incentivise or reward donors, nudge them, if you like, in the current jargon, to get to be better and do more giving. And I understand that in the thinking that led to the 2006 Charities Act, there was consideration given to the idea of differential tax relief in order to encourage donors to select the right causes. But it was rejected because there would be losers. Now, my objective is not to avoid losers, but I do think we need to think about how we grow the pie of charitable giving while we also reallocate it. So we need to mitigate the effects on the losers. Now, all of this, I think, needs more research and experimentation, and I think in these austere times, it's hard to see how it gets funded. But that doesn't make it any less important. I think we do need a system of classification of charities to inform donor choices and encourage better decisions. And we might want differential tax relief in time to reinforce that and get people to give more smartly. But I don't think yet, as a society, we're ready for this. Donors don't care enough, and I'm not sure they would respond adequately to the right information and stimuli. But I think the most pressing need is to start to build a greater understanding of this issue, and maybe a consensus to support it, beginning with more public debate about charitable giving and donor behaviour. I think it would be premature to start developing and promoting a system of classification now. Let's not reach that far, but I'm quite clear that's the direction of travel I think we should go in. And if I can help that by encouraging more debate, that seems worthwhile. Thank you.
Well, Martin said he wanted to be provocative. I think he probably managed that. Our respondent is Anne-Marie Piper, who's, as I say, head of the charity and community team at Farrer and Companies. And I think it's going to be interesting to know whether she ranks the charitable clients that she has in terms of their worthiness, something we can, I'm sure, hear now. Anne-Marie.
Well, there'll be no surprises there, ladies and gentlemen. As a woman who earns her living advising charities right across the sector, I am in no way about to embark upon advocating a worthiness league for charitable causes. What I hope to do, because I agree very much with Martin that this is a debate that needs to take place, what I'm going to try and do this evening is give you some historical context to show that we've never been very good at charitable giving. The way in which charity law is developed is a series of random incidents and missed opportunities. I'm then going to confess to my own giving habits, which until recently I'd never really looked at, and that is, for somebody who's on the front line of the sector, really rather a shameful admission. And then I'm just going to end with a few observations, which I hope will add to the debate. So the starting point for English charity law was the Reformation. Up until then, most charitable giving had been focused at the churches and in particular at the monasteries. Dissolve the monasteries and then all of a sudden you've got a bit of a hole. By 1601, Parliament had got round to developing something called the Statute of Charitable Uses, uses meaning purposes. And the preamble to that act set out the purposes, or the majority of them, not all of them, the purposes which were regarded as charitable in 1601. Some of which seem remarkably familiar, some of which are not things we wouldn't necessarily recognise. Martin referred to burning witches. There are other examples. One I came across which was remarkably topical. But the tried and tested ones, the relief of the aged, impotent and poor people, the maintenance of sick and maimed soldiers and mariners, schools of learning, free schools and scholars in universities, so far so good. The education and preferment of orphans, no surprises here. One that, as I say, the one that took me by surprise was the relief, stock or maintenance of houses of correction. Remember all that debate we had a couple of years ago about whether charity should run prisons? It seems the Elizabethans were ahead of us on that one. The system has developed since 1601 until the Charities Act 2006 without any legislative involvement at all, using a system called precedent and analogy. initially by the courts, but in recent years by the Charity Commission too. And by and large, until the middle of the 19th century, the law was tended to be made in relation to wills. Whether a gift was or was not charitable was whether or not it was valid. Because under the law, if you have a personal trust, there is a beneficiary who can come along if the trustees are not doing as they should do to enforce it. The law does not recognise non-charitable purpose trusts because there is nobody to enforce it. So whether a trust was capable of being enforced by the Attorney General was the subject of most of these cases about wills. And the courts then used a system of precedent and analogy. If it had been charitable before, it was probably still going to be charitable. That's British, we don't move on too fast, as Martin said. And then analogy. If it wasn't charitable before, is it the sort of thing which, had the Elizabethans thought about it at the time, that they'd have included in the list? And the obvious examples there are sort of animal welfare. The Elizabethans liked a bit of bear baiting, so there was not a lot of animal welfare on their list. Similarly, deforestation was not a burning issue at that time, so you won't find the environment or environmental causes on the list. But these are the sort of things that the courts and the Commission over the years have decided that, had they had the sort of current mores, the Elizabethans probably would have included in their lists, and therefore they've been so. This rambled on until the end of the 19th century, when a jurist after my own heart, Lord Macnaghten, in the famous case of Pencil, decided that we had to bring some order to this. So he came up with 4 categories or heads of charity. And these 4 categories were the advancement of education, the advancement of religion, the relief of the poor, the aged and the infirm, and, ever a good man, all other charitable purposes recognised by the courts that don't fall into the first 3 categories. So this is where we had all our expansion over the years. And that chugged along until the 2006 Act. And I was very excited in 2004 when I heard we were going to have a new Charities Act and we were going to look at charitable purposes, because it wasn't initially on the list. And I thought, at last, we are going to have a public debate about what should or shouldn't be charitable. I, for one, wanted to see religious organisations removed from the list of charitable purposes. I was perfectly happy for them to have a comparable status, to keep all the tax breaks. I didn't want to disenfranchise them from any of the benefits of charity. But I do a lot of religious charity work, and I'm afraid I've long been of the opinion that God just doesn't do governance. The rules that we try and apply to non-religious organisations really rarely work. I've never yet met a congregant who could really seriously take his religious leader to task in the way that is required by charity trustees, sometimes of their employees. So I thought, at last, we'll have a real debate. But unfortunately, we didn't have a debate. Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister at the time, stood up very quickly and said, the charitable purposes that will be in the 2006, as it was to become, Charities Act, are a codification of the law. They are not an extension or an expansion or a reduction of any charitable purposes. Nothing which before the Act was charitable would cease to be charitable, and nothing that wasn't charitable would become charitable. So I'm afraid a real big missed opportunity. The position got slightly more complicated because at that time we were also living in the world of devolution, and so Scotland and Northern Ireland, which are separate legal systems, have developed their own rules on what are charitable purposes under the law, and they vary slightly, not hugely. And interestingly, since the charity sector has sort of put its arms up in horror, the regulators are all working together, and it's surprising how often that they decide that although their statutes are different, their thinking is very similar. Martin hinted at the Charity Commission and their role in assessing charities. Have some sympathy. There are 160,000 plus charities on the register, and the Charity Commission, like all other government bodies, are suffering cuts. There's a limited, they have a limited constitutional role and very limited resources, so I'm afraid they're not going to be able to help very much in this respect. However, it's wrong to say that charity law doesn't actually have a little stab at this hierarchy. It does, and it does so in the public benefit aspect. Because the reason we've got very little law on public benefit, and everybody's been getting in a real lather about it, was in the days of Lord Macnaghten's cases, the first 3 heads of charity, the relief of the poor, the aged, the infirm, the advancement of education, the advancement of religion, they all had their charitable public benefit presumed. And in 2006, it was that presumption that was removed. The law didn't change. They've always had to show it. It was just presumed. And there were one or two cases. Every law student learnt when they did their charity law course about the case of a closed order of nuns who argued that their public benefit was in praying for the wider community. And the judge very regretfully said that to the Mother Superior that I'm afraid that's not quite public enough, mum. So that was a sort of classic case of how the presumption could be rebutted. But basically, there was very little law, and the Charity Commission had to find public benefit law. But when you go back through the cases, those charities for the relief of the poor, those charities for the relief of sick, it's always been possible to establish a charity to help a very small number of people. I once did a case where we established a charity for the sufferers of a particular medical condition, and there were only 3 known in the UK at that time. So in those cases, you contrast that with an arts charity, which has to have a very, very much wider public remit to be able to show its public benefit. So there is a little bit. We've got something to build on if we wanted to go back to the legislative framework. Now for the confession. I was appalled. I got my accounts out, which I don't usually look at. They go straight off to the accountant. But I got my Just Giving certificate, and I looked at my giving. There is some instances where I might be described as a high-impact giver, but I'm afraid they're very, very small. Most of the time, I'm not good or moral or high-impact. The small number of high-impact cases are cases where I'm a trustee or I have a close connection with them, and because of the nature of my work, I suspect I choose very unpopular causes because I know they'll have a hard job raising money elsewhere. So far, so good. We then have the enforced giving. We are a partnership, like most partnerships, that has a in-house charity. I have my arm up my back, like my other partners, to write a large cheque once a year, which is given over to the charitable trust, and a committee of my partners decide on a variety of courses. That's what they call outsourcing your giving. And then the third category, which was the one that accounted for a very large amount, might well be described as the Friends and Family Fitness Campaign, where I'm supporting people. And I was ashamed to say that in most of the cases, I had no idea what cause I was supporting. It was just Cousin Susie was running the triathlon and, you know, Cousin Fred was doing this or whatever. And there, I was completely negligent. I had no idea what I was giving to. But I think we mess with the it's my money and I'll spend it like I want to at our peril. And one of the developments that I was very unhappy to see, and I still moan to anybody who listened to it on the subject, was a scheme that started very worthily and very well intentioned a few years ago, where at Christmas time, if you went out to dine in a restaurant, you'd have a little card on your table that said, unless you objected, £1 would be added to your bill. Now, I come from a very poor background, and I very much remember the days when I counted every penny I had when I went to the supermarket or went to a restaurant. And I don't like that making people feel bad about having to ask to take something like that off. So I think that that element of sort of giving in that way is something we should discourage. But pure altruism is not what's necessarily involved. If you give to a poverty charity, you don't expect anything in return. But in some sectors, you do. It's very common, for example, with arts organisations to find they can only raise money if they run membership schemes which offer preferential things for their members. Not altruism really at all. If we're going to do as Martin says and have a wider debate, we need to increase people's understanding. The Charity Commission has very little time to do very much more of that. And I'm afraid it is the case that big charities have no incentive to do so. If you are Cancer Research UK, you will go to great lengths, I don't doubt, for very high-level donors. But most of the time, people who have a relative who suffered from cancer and want to collect money in their name will just pick a name that they know and they understand. It's not in the interest of the big cancer charities to explain what a wide range of cancer charities they might give to. It's a difficult subject to explain. I specialise in fundraising law, and for many years we've had this debate about how do you engage the public and explain to them that raising money costs money. Administration is actually part of delivering the charitable services. Don't underestimate the task. But there's some good work being done, and I think one development we should watch with interest is the concept of social investment, where people invest money, not expecting to get the best return they possibly can, but to get some return. Now, if your money is invested in something, I suspect you will look much more critically at how the organisation is run and what it's doing. And so, as charities morph sometimes into social enterprises, that is an area where I think we may encourage, people may have a self-interest in learning more. And the other thing is there's some great philanthropy projects going on out there with young donors. I act for one Jewish charity, which when children have their bar mitzvah or their bat mitzvah, they're given money, they're encouraged to give it to the charity and the charity will match it. And they then run courses to teach the children to choose the causes that money is going to be spent on. More of that, and perhaps more education in schools, and the future might look brighter.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anne-Marie. We have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. Because I'm sitting here, I get to go first. There are some microphones at the side. I'll take a round of questions in just one moment, but I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask. Martin, I'm thinking of forming a charity called the Irrationality League, which is pledged to ensure that people are able to do things which are not rational, which don't make sense, which are a little bit crazy, maybe are ultimately immoral. Why can't I have a charity that does that?
Well, I wouldn't know whether you can have that under law. I'll defer to Anne-Marie on that basis. But I'm not saying that all giving should be rational, or all giving should be kind of supremely moral. What I'm saying is at the moment it's so vastly at the other extreme. So little of how we give our money is thoughtful, is moral, well-directed, that there must be room for improvement. You know, the people don't engage much at all when they think about their giving. The distribution of money, if you look at it between organisations, is very striking. We see organisations at NPC all the time that are doing great work, having a real impact, and really struggling for funding. So there's such an imbalance at the moment that I think we need to address it. I'm not against irrationality or responsive sort of giving. I just think that should be the exception rather than the rule.
The other thing I just wanted to ask you about, your league table of worthiness. You mentioned the Stradivarius, right? Music, beauty. I think these are actually really critical things for the human condition. It's easy to dismiss them. So I jotted a few thoughts down as to how we might. Perhaps you could help me with the order of these. Learning, that was one of the ones from 1601 or whenever it was. Music, the planet, that was quite an important thing. A single life, clean water, donkeys. Right. So which order?
Some in there are easy. I don't think. What I think would be. I'm not saying I know what the ordering should be or that my ordering.
But is there an order?
No, I think there should be. I think we should have a discussion about what the ordering should be. I mean, implicitly, we end up with an ordering by virtue of aggregating all our individual acts of giving. So there is an ordering. It's the ordering that says that not enough money goes to charities that tackle domestic violence and domestic abuse, and frankly, too much money goes to donkey sanctuaries. There is an ordering. It's there. You can see it in income. You can see it in reserves as well. What I'm saying is that there is no rationality or reason behind the ordering we end up with when we aggregate all our individual acts of giving. And I think if we have a kind of deliberative process where we think through as a society what is most important, what should be prioritised, I think we would end up with better giving. I would hope if we can get donors to engage with their brains. My particular ordering is irrelevant.
You're accusing them of being fickle, casual and lazy. I mean, it's hard enough to get people to give anyway without suggesting that someone's going to be on their case.
Yeah, we've got a big problem. I'm not underestimating the scale of the problem, but I think we have to work out ways in which we tackle it, rather than remaining with the present system which says all charities are equally worthy, people do what they like, and then we end up with an absurd distribution of funding.
You say.
I say.
And Anne-Marie, I just wanted to ask you, because you mentioned this word altruism, and you talked about morality, but altruism as an idea. And there's this government idea which they've already started, social impact bonds. People that see investment, they're going to make money out of this. It's a profit-making enterprise, but it goes off to some social enterprises. That's going to it's going to deliver what we used to regard as state services, but going to be delivered by the big society. But there is a difference, isn't there, between doing something which is absolutely, I'm not interested in any kind of return. I don't want to get free membership to the art club. I don't expect a profit. I just, out of the goodness of my heart, want to give something I have to somebody else to make their lives better.
Yeah, but the boundaries are not clear. Dame Mary March, who's in the audience, wrote a piece or gave a lecture recently on this, and it's something that's troubled charity lawyers for ages. One of the best ways to, for example, regenerate an area and make people's lives better is to, for example, build factories or places of work. Now, if you give subsidised rents to encourage people to come to the area, you are doing good, but you are also tipping over the flip side of the public benefit coin, which is that there must not be an element, an acceptable element of private benefit. And this balance is, when is there too much private benefit? When has somebody else got too much out of this to outweigh? And this is one of those debates that the Charity Commission and the courts have to have as to what it is. And so it's very difficult because often you can do good, but you help people on the way. Does that matter?